All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here on LinkedIn Live. This is IronNet's April Cyber Lookback. We are excited to have you here. Today's session is titled MS Exchange, the PRODAFT chapter, and the hackback debate. So thank you guys for joining us. If you are joining us here on LinkedIn Live, if you would please say, hey, thanks for having us, or hey, glad to be here in the chat below. It kind of lets me see who's joining us. We are doing this for you. So the cool part is if you guys can give us some claps or thumbs up, it pops your face up there so we know kind of who's watching and we can kind of respond to your questions that way. So give us thumbs up, give us some likes, and support the individuals we have here on this stream. So that is some housekeeping out of the way. With that out of the way, I want to introduce our guest speakers today. Now, these two individuals, I promise, these are the individuals you want to stick around and get your cybersecurity news from. The first is the newest member to the Cyber Lookback live stream team. He's also new to our threat analysis and intelligence team here at IronNet. Joey Fitzpatrick, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Joel.
You got it. Next up is our threat analysis lead. This gentleman's been an instrumental part of not only putting these together, but keeping our entire company informed about the latest threats impacting the landscape, the TTPs being used, and the actors who are using them. Peter Rudzinski, once again, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Joel.
You got it. Now, looks like we have some people liking. Let's go ahead and jump in and just say hi to everybody. Looks like Marie Grace, welcome. Glad to be here. Let me go ahead and throw this on the screen since I can. That's kind of fun. Thanks so much. So once again, if you guys say glad to be here or throw something in the chat supporting Peter and Joey, I'll try to throw it up here on the screen and get you guys your little moment to shine. Also joining us today, we have TJ Scholl, we have Anthony Grenga, we have, let's see, Halit. Thank you for joining us, and Christine as well. So guys, once again, please go ahead and give some thumbs up, some claps so we can see that you're in here and hanging out with us here today. Now, Peter, let's jump right into the content. But before we do that, will you kind of explain to our audience how we're going to lay out this session? Because we're kind of going off the cuff a little or off our norm.
Yeah, sure, Joel. So we are going to be talking about the two major incidents that have come up in the month of March. Obviously, the Microsoft Exchange stuff has dominated the news cycles, as well as recently we saw a PRODAFT report outlining some of the supposed connections to SolarWinds attacks and what's going on that front. Both of those are going to be heavily focused on the Windows side. We've got clients that are being targeted in the PRODAFT stuff. Obviously, Microsoft Exchange focuses on Microsoft and Windows-based stuff. So we wanted to provide some Linux updates as well, because I'm sure that we've got a lot of Linux administrators out there, but unfortunately, that some of the news might have gotten lost in the limelight with all of the focus on Windows stuff. So we'll first jump into some Linux news, and then we'll jump into the actual big items for this month.
Awesome. Now, Peter and Joey, we had a couple thank yous. Michael Ehrlich says, Dr. Michael Ehrlich says, thanks for educating us all. We also have a gentleman named Michael who's in Switzerland right now and says, hey, glad to be here. So you guys are having an international impact in sharing the cybersecurity news and threat intelligence. So thank you guys for all you do. And so let's jump in, Peter, because you mentioned, hey, we got to touch on the Microsoft Exchange stuff. But first, let's talk to our Linux community and some of the things that we're seeing impact their community. So with that, Peter, will you jump into our breaking news segment and talk to us about the Linux pseudo vulnerabilities that we're seeing impact the Linux community?
Yeah, so this one comes to us from researchers out of Grim, great research organization. They've pumped out a lot of really interesting vulnerabilities and things. But basically what we've seen here is that once again, I mean, this seems like the same old, but we have once again 15-year-old bugs that were discovered back in the early stages of the development of the iSCSI kernel modules themselves. So these things have been around since about 2006 when this first was being developed, and it's crazy to see that dug up now, and it makes you wonder how much what happened between then and now, and who maybe knew about these bugs that weren't good researchers who reported this to get fixed, but rather actors and adversaries willing to use it. But in this case, the flaws affected virtually all flavors of Linux. But luckily, the vulnerable kernel modules themselves are not loaded by default. However, unfortunately, they're fairly easy to be loaded, so it's not very difficult for an actor to trigger those modules to be loaded. And this can be done in two ways, by either triggering the kernel to recognize new hardware that's been added to the system, at which point those modules are loaded, as well as when the kernel observes a function that has a dependency on something from those modules as well. So that can also trigger those to be loaded, which then allows the actor to take advantage of the vulnerabilities, which basically gives them root privileges, as well as allows them to bypass many of the kernel level protections, including ASLR and other things that stop attackers from using buffer overflows and dumping memory and observing things and escalating to root. So yeah, this is a little tricky here, not super easy to deal with from a host perspective, except to update. So we're highly recommending people update their kernel modules in this case. One thing to take note of, the last point here, would be that this is not a remote exploitable bug. This is not something that you're going to get hacked from off of the internet or from any remote network-based attack. This is actually just a local bug, so it can only only allows an attacker, once they've already exploited your machine, to escalate privileges and do things further from there. But does not mean that you shouldn't take this as seriously as a remote exploitable bug. I think you're muted, Joel.
I am muted. Thank you, sir. Quote of the year here in 20.
That's right.
But no, so you're telling me, so let's say box is compromised, they could then download those modules, escalate privileges, and it's almost trivial at that point.
Yeah, the modules actually exist on the boxes already, so there's no downloading that needs to take place. They're actually just loaded into execution at that point. So they're not constantly being executed. They're not constantly available, but triggering that load is not difficult.
It's trivial in nature. Wow. So yeah, be aware of that. Once again, Peter's recommendation for this was update your kernel modules. Fantastic. Now, over to you, Joey. Let's talk about this new Linux backdoor that we're seeing in the wild, and just dig into it for me a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So this Linux backdoor, this is from the folks over from Integer. They did research on this, and they coined it Red Azure. And so this is a Linux backdoor masquerading as a Polkit daemon. And so obviously the question is, well, what is that, right? So the Polkit is basically a toolkit for applications that allows unprivileged processes to speak to privileged processes. This is a little bit in contrast to perhaps sudo, where when you run a sudo command, it runs that whole process as privileged, right? But with the Polkit toolkit, what you're allowed to do is actually be more precise and say, hey, within this process, I just want these modules, right, to run as privileged access. Nice for developers, right? More granular access. It's pretty cool. So based on the victims and TTPs of these, the folks over at Integer were able to look at, they believe it was a Chinese threat actor who actually helped create this. And some of the things that led to that was that some of the samples are coming out of Taiwan, and obviously if you've been watching the news and global community, what's going on right now, so there's tension there, right? And so also they were targeting legacy Linux systems, and they were able to look at that by looking at samples that were compiled, and they were compiled with a legacy GCC compiler, and they've done that on an old Red Hat Linux version. So that's the reason how they derive that. And then typical we're seeing nowadays is that you're not just getting a tool, you're getting a whole tool suite. And so this malware is packed with the usual suite of tools where abilities to install rootkit, open a shell, create network tunnels for direct access. I mean, this thing has it all. So pretty sophisticated, and it makes sense what we're seeing today.
Well, and we just keep seeing this modular malware, right? I mean, you're seeing you can open shells, create network tunnels for direct access. I mean, it's just getting started, right? This modular type of malware is not going away anytime soon, right, Joey?
Absolutely. I think we're going to keep seeing this, and it looks like maybe and perhaps on certain victims, the threat actors will only run certain modules, or they'll only give certain modules, right? So you're not able to understand the whole suite of tools right away by understanding one victim.
Mm.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, obviously, like you just mentioned, Joel, the modular malware is becoming standard. This is expected at this point. That malware has the capability to add new features to it on demand. But it should be noted that as I was going through this research for this article, we noticed that a lot of people are talking about 2020 as a breakout year for Linux malware. And this goes back to some of the predictions that we made last year going into 2021, that 2021 is going to be the year of server exploitation. And that trend seems to be continuing here, where we've really locked down hosts pretty well. We've come, there's this swing and reaction to a lot of host-based phishing and a lot of host-based compromise, and now we're seeing a move back towards server-based compromise. And we don't have a lot of protections on that angle, especially when you talk about Linux. And I think what we're going to dive into today highlights that very well, where we've seen a lot of Linux malware come out recently, and I think that's going to continue. And it sort of gets hidden, and it's not really brought up quite as much. But I think it's going to continue to be a problem that plagues systems administrators.
Wow, and I've never actually thought about it that way, but really, when you look back over the last 3 years, like, phishing was at the front of everybody's mind, right? I mean, the amount of phishing cybersecurity products that are out there on the market now, I mean, it just got flooded with phishing, right? So we are aware that was an issue, and now that those defenses are in place, we're going to see this pivot in techniques. And I think you teed it up perfectly for this next section, right, Peter? So now that we have those Linux issues out of the way, we've had SolarWinds. Now we have this Microsoft Exchange issue. And this is almost just as big. That's the crazy part. Now, while we're seeing ransomware being exploited due to these Exchange vulnerabilities, that is really just the tip of the iceberg. Peter, can you dig deeper into this iceberg for us? Tell us more about what's happening with this.
Sure. Yeah, and I think you kind of led into that perfectly, which is, we dealt with SolarWinds in December and January, into February, obviously, but as we went into March, this came up really right in the face of everything. It was difficult to process because, it's hard to compare to what happened with SolarWinds, but I think you're right that we should look at this as almost just as significant of an event as SolarWinds, especially when you talk about the breadth and scope of what we observed here, and really the access that was gained by the exploitation of these servers. But jumping into the specifics here, basically the entire Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities comes down to 4 zero-day vulnerabilities that were discovered both by researchers, but then once this discovery occurred from researchers, there was evidence that this was being used actively by APTs already. And so, although we had this interesting timeline of discovery, we also had some indications that actors were already using this vulnerability to gain access to these systems. So basically, the suspected threat actors are Chinese, sophisticated espionage-related actors. They are categorizing this as a new group called Hafnium. Now, they've seen some previous activity from this group, but this is the first time that they've sort of named it Hafnium and called this out. But again, pretty standard, super sophisticated Chinese information gathering campaigns. As to the vulnerabilities specifically, there are 4 vulnerabilities themselves. 4 CVEs were released on this. Basically, the vulnerabilities can be used independently or chained. Obviously, chained vulnerabilities allow for a little extra access and capability. So in this case, that's what we've observed most of the time, is that these vulnerabilities are chained. However, in isolation, each vulnerability basically is a server-side request forgery, which allows for arbitrary file upload and arbitrary code execution, as well as a few other bypasses that allow actors to put files on systems without privileges. And so obviously that's super valuable from the standpoint of Microsoft Exchange because of where the Exchange server typically sits and what type of service it provides. Now that everybody has moved from mail servers that just do mail, they've moved towards Outlook on the web and things like that. Mail servers come with web servers sort of alongside them. And so in this case, that's exactly what is the core problem here, which is the fact that not only did they gain access to your mail server, but there's a web server there which allows them to use web communications to interact with the web shell, and as such, dump all of the emails out, extract a bunch of information, as well as move laterally from there. So, those combined vulnerabilities, along with the fact that an Exchange server sits in the DMZ and runs as a web server, is sort of the crux of why these vulnerabilities and this exploitation has blown up to such a degree. And so basically, the trend that we're seeing is originally we had very targeted exploitation by the Hafnium group. And then interestingly, along the timeline, we see an explosion of exploitation that has then moved off from just the Hafnium group, but into other APT organizations as well as other cybercrime organizations as well. And so breaking down that timeline, it has been kind of interesting. And some of the best research has come out of, obviously, Krebs on security, where he really broke down the exact dates and when all of these things occurred. And so I've just pulled out a couple of the most important dates and times that happened, just to outline this interesting timeline that we've observed. So, firstly, the initial discovery of these vulnerabilities was on. Yes.
Peter, real quick, I want you to jump into this timeline, but first, you covered a lot of really, really good content in there. I want to open it up to our audience members and let them know, hey guys, if you have questions for Peter on this, we do this for you. Please, please, please put your questions in the chat. You know, if you want more clarifying or more details, trust me, Peter can go deeper into this topic. So please get your questions into the chat. Let's get them over to the professionals here, and we'll get them answered for you today. So Peter, I do apologize for interrupting. Jump back to this timeline for me.
Yeah,
showed us.
Yeah, so the timeline basically, again, initial discovery was on January 6th, and this is when the actual researchers came forward to Microsoft and said, hey, this is an issue. And so quickly after that, Microsoft, churned on that, determined that it was a real issue, and began working on POC code. In between that initial notification to Microsoft and February 23rd, they began to write a POC that could be distributed to trusted partners for use in antivirus detections. And so this POC code, once it was released on February 23rd, that's where the things get interesting. Not 3 days later, that's when we saw this shift from highly targeted, selective exploitation by the Hafnium group, moving on to broad, massive exploitation from a litany of actors. And so it's this 3-day window that is what's given people a lot of suspicion as to what happened here. And so if we dive back into the timeline, it was on March 2nd that a patch was released, and this was actually a week earlier than originally intended because Microsoft had to accelerate their timelines after this explosion of exploitation. Interestingly, people immediately noticed this and started to speculate as to why this happened and what was going on. This caused a lot of stir in the cybersecurity community because obviously this represents a breach of trust when we're talking about very sensitive proof of concept code that outlines how a 0-day operates being leaked prior to a patch. That's a significant issue with our security processes. And so Microsoft actually on March 12th opened up an investigation to what had happened, whether that was a intentional leak by one of their trusted partners, or whether this was an inadvertent leak by one of their trusted partners, or how or what it was that actually caused this explosion. And we haven't really heard any update on that yet, but that's something we'll be paying very close attention to because we do want to figure out what happened, what went wrong, and why did this blow up before patches came out.
Now, Peter, can you talk a little bit more about the organizations who would have an on-prem Exchange server? Like, what does that look like from an enterprise perspective?
Sure. I mean, a litany of organizations, to be honest. There's no one-size-fits-all example here, and I think that's part of the issue is that actually there were suspected 125,000 vulnerable servers at one point on the internet. And so if you go back again to the points that we were making originally about comparing this to SolarWinds, it's very clear right there. You can see the scope and breadth of this attack is far greater, where SolarWinds affected many thousands of companies, but nothing on that order. And furthermore, each of those particular affected companies had to have been targeted by the Russians. And so not everybody who was affected by the update, the malicious update, was necessarily hacked beyond that initial infection. And so this is where that is different, is that you have a remotely exploitable bug that allows anybody in. And so in this case, it's not just the Russians that have this unique access and malware that's deployed inside a system. Anybody can deploy their malware on these Exchange servers. And so yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all company that runs on-prem Exchange. You have everything from small businesses up to mega corporations, giant, massive corporations that are running their own Exchange servers. So there's everybody in between.
Yeah, and I think you said something really interesting. You said on the internet. And I think that's key, is because if you have an on-prem Exchange, guess what? That is accessible, and it may be in the DMZ, but it has to be able to send emails outside your enterprise environment, which means people can see that and they know it's publicly exploitable, and everybody's got this proof of concept code. It's kind of terrifying. So no, thank you for digging into that, Peter.
Absolutely. So some final points here is one thing to take note of is obviously during that timeline, this mass exploitation began around February 27, February 26 timeframe. And it's really interesting that we didn't actually see reports of ransomware that started to blow up until well into March. We were looking at like early March, mid-March, when things really started to pick up and we saw ransomware. And so it's unclear if that delay is due to the ransomware operators who gained access to their networks but didn't fully exploit the entire network. They didn't have full domain compromise, so they didn't fully deploy ransomware, and we didn't see the side effects of that until many days later. Or if this is because there's actually something else going on in between that February 27 timeframe and the mid-March timeframe when we saw ransomware blow up. But I did want to mention that now that we have had some time since those exploits have been publicly released, we have seen an absolutely massive increase in ransomware on this side, which is absolutely expected given the nature of the type of server that Exchange is. So, as you mentioned, Joel, Exchange is deployed in the DMZ typically for somewhat remote access as well as internal access. And as such, it is highly integrated with Active Directory and is a juicy target for an actor like this who can very easily dump memory, get access to sensitive credentials, and then use that to pivot to Active Directory domain controllers and use that to then distribute ransomware and compromise your domain completely. So, not surprising to see, and definitely some big news has come out, not only with new ransomware families, including the DeerCry ransomware that has been newly observed during this campaign, as well as we've seen Acer suspected to have been hit through these proxy logon Microsoft Exchange related vulnerabilities that we saw the largest ransomware demand come out of them, with $50 million demanded by the ransomware crew. So we've never seen one as big as that. So not only have we seen new ransomware, but we've seen the largest ransomware demands coming out of this. And then on top of that, there was some sort of more humorous, but obviously not for the company that was affected, but we saw some more humorous malware where the operators actually said, created their C2 domains as krebsonsecurity.top. And so you saw some interesting ransomware using, security researchers' names as their C2 as well. So it's been quite a wild ride tracking all of the second and third level effects of these vulnerabilities as this progresses.
Well, and that's a great point. So while you were talking about, the DeerCry, I threw up a heat map of where it's been seen so far, and you'll see it's actually impacting international, kind of the India, Indonesia, but it's also hitting Ireland, Luxembourg, and then a little bit here in the United States. So do we know if ASIS was the DeerCry ransomware? Have we?
I believe it was actually REvil that they were affected with. Yep, different flavor, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, new forms of ransomware are coming to the United States near you. So be prepared, know what that looks like. And thank you, Peter, for keeping us up to date on that.
One question I have for Joey is, can you help me speculate on whether companies should move to the cloud? Because one important note here was that this vulnerability and these exploits were only effective against on-prem Exchange servers. And as such, those that had already moved to the cloud were actually immune to this. Now, it's not to say that everyone who moves to the cloud is safe, but at a certain point, this is a nice little argument against all of those systems administrators who are typically like, oh, I don't want to go to the cloud. It's not safe. I don't control it. It's not, operated by me. I can't have my hands on. This is another example of where you may not want to have your hands on. And so I'm just curious, Joey, what are your thoughts on who should move to the cloud, and when should people consider that running on-prem servers might not be the best idea?
Yeah, absolutely, Pete. And great question. I think this is a question that sysadmins and C-suite often ask themselves, whether you're a small mom and pop company, right, or less than 100 users, or up to a few thousand. The issue we have here is that there's just been a huge push to the cloud in the past few years, right? And we've always, the security community has pushed back and said, hey, just because you move to the cloud doesn't mean you're more safe, right? And that's absolutely true. But I think in this aspect here, this is one of those services where, in my opinion, it doesn't make sense to run on-prem, right? I mean, Exchange is a beast. And as you know, he said, it has a web server. And it lies in your DMZ, and it has a unique relationship with the Active Directory, right? Your domain controller. And so once they gain access to that, and public-facing servers whacking it, they can easily pivot, like you said, to your domain controller, which is your crown jewels, right? That's not a good day for anyone. And what you saw here with Hafnium is this is a typical Chinese TTP, right? Where they want to go after intellectual property and other sorts of information. And this is their MO. And what better place than the Exchange server, which literally has all your internal communications to your company sitting in a demilitarized zone. I mean, what other service does that, right? And you don't see this, like if you were to subscribe to like gmail.com, Gmail doesn't say, well, do you want to run on-prem or do you want to do a cloud? It's command cloud. And so I think if you're a company and you don't feel like you can run a web application firewall to help protect it and understand Exchange super well, plus you need a RAID server, like all these things. And then, oh, by the way, these patches that Microsoft delivered, they need to be restarted. So you need to take the service down for some point. And so, at some point, it's just like, if you don't want any of that headache, and oh, by the way, instant response, right? If you were to get hacked, you have to deal with all that stuff. So why not just for $5, $10 a month, and I'm not being paid by Azure, right? But just hand it over to Microsoft. I think, in my opinion, that makes a lot more sense. And we need to get that. Small, medium businesses need to get out of the habit of running those servers on-prem.
Yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate though, because if you have on-prem Exchange, you have invested a lot of money into this Exchange server, right? I mean, there is hardware. It is a heavy investment up front. And now, so let's say we migrate to the cloud, right? And we take your advice. Hey, it's much more affordable to go O365 and go Exchange in the cloud. Well, now you need to be able to monitor that environment, right? You need to, and so now you are buying into more tools and Microsoft Azure, the security suite, and they have, their Sentinel and ATP are the only ones that can really visualize all that data well. And they may have done that on purpose. I'm not going either which way on that, but so you got to make a decision because you may have an investment already. And if you decide to move that investment, you're going to have to buy additional monitoring tools that only Microsoft provides.
Yeah, Joel, great point. Yeah,
sorry, Joey. No, I just think it's tricky because the challenge is that it's not as simple as and you're right, you're caught between a rock and a hard place where if you move to the cloud, there's a lot of baggage that goes along with that. But you're also in a position where if you don't move services like this to the cloud, you're going to continue to have to run a DMZ. And I think that having a DMZ, even just simply having it, is already puts a defender at a disadvantage because it's an avenue, it's an additional window that needs to be covered. It's an additional hole that needs to be blocked for attackers to come in. It's more monitoring that is on you to do. It's more responsibility from your standpoint. And so, as Joey was pointing out, you might be you might be responsible for monitoring your environments in Azure and things like that, and you have to buy additional services. But when you do get compromised, and it's because of a 0-day like this, that is no longer your responsibility. It is the responsibility of Microsoft to clean up their services and what exploitation and access was gained through that. Whereas if you deploy on-prem, as Joey mentioned, great, I got the patches, I installed the patches. You still have to go and find those web shells. This could have been Hafnium, which is a sophisticated APT. Do you want to be cleaning up after that? Do you have the expertise to clean up after that? And then secondly, you've got cybercrime. So now it's all cluttered with you could potentially have been hit with ransomware and things like that. And so if you just simply move to the cloud, you shift that responsibility off of yourself, and costs go down because of that. And so it's very difficult to calculate out which is the best decision. But as of now, I just don't see a way that running on-prem is more cost effective in a situation like this than moving to the cloud.
No, and that's a totally fair point. I do have to point out that in the SolarGate breach, Microsoft came out and they said part of their Intune source code was leaked. So I just want to let it be known, Intune is basically deeply integrated into Azure security that then helps cover all of O365. So have we seen anything come from that yet? No, absolutely not. But will we? I guess we'll have to wait and find out. So let's go ahead and keep jumping through this. I know we're sitting at 11:30 already. Once again, thank you. If you're watching this here on LinkedIn Live, will you give these guys a quick thumbs up or a clap? I mean, these guys spend prep time getting all this information to you, doing the research on this content so that they can deliver it to you in a way that can be easily absorbed. So if you're watching here on LinkedIn Live, smash that thumbs up button or that clap button for these guys and show them a little support. Also, if you have questions about any of these topics, we're going to be getting into a hackback conversation. So please, we would love your insights or your questions on the topics that we're talking about here in the chat here in LinkedIn Live. So, all right, now we've talked about the Exchange server vulnerabilities, the 4.0 days, the ransomware with Dear Cry being a new variant. Now we're going to switch over into the PRODAFT report. So real quick, there's two totally different types of motives in these types of attacks. We're seeing advanced compromises through SolarWinds DevOps lifecycle, right? And then we're seeing Chinese threat actors digging into networks and trying to monetize the situation much more effectively, right? Now what we're seeing is organizations, and in this case, nation states, begin to respond in interesting ways. Joey, will you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is regarding the PRODAFT report that came out of a Swiss security firm, and they released this about 2 weeks ago, actually, from today. And their analysis is quite interesting. And what Joel's alluding to, right, is that their analysis of the C2 server, and which is totally different than what we've seen before, because typically you're not able to access the inner workings of this, right, for a multitude of reasons, whether that be skill or legal reasons, right? And so real quick, so Prodaf was able to grab an IOC indicator of compromise from a FireEye report regarding SolarWinds back in December. And so they took that IOC, databasegalore.com, and they're able to create a fingerprint. Now, we don't know what the fingerprint is that they created. It's also part of their proprietary process. So they mentioned in one of the TLP, perhaps TLP read on their side, that their subscribers are able to access that and understand how that fingerprint is created. But for the TLP white report, they created a fingerprint. That's all we know. And so using that fingerprint, they were able to scan a whole /24. And then they found about 200 computers or servers up there. And from there, they kind of narrowed it down. And which is interesting, in the next part of the report, it kind of skips a little bit and it says, hey, we gained access to the C2 server. And so with
So pause there, because
real
quick, this is a big deal. So let's first share what PRODAFT stands for. PRODAFT stands for Proactive Defense Against Future Threats. So that's PRODAFT. So you're telling me when they released this, they said we gained access to the C2 server, but in order to do that, it's not just like walking through a front door. What would they have had to do to gain access to that, Joey?
Yeah, great question, Joel. So we can only speculate here, right? But this is, and if you're an adversary, right, you're not going to leave your C2 server up and have the web portion of that just open to anybody in the web. And they described this in the report. So what we can allude to is that they must have hacked the server, right? There must have been some sort of vulnerability or perhaps some sort of credentials they gathered, and they were able to actually log into the C2 server. And now when they logged in there, they said, hey, I had, some after protection, and I had the ability to the firewall, you're only able to log in through certain IPs, right? And so they must have figured out a way to actually gain access to the server. And so when they did, they're able to see a web interface which showed the traffic from the victims beaconing back through traffic distribution servers. And then once the callbacks came to the C2 server, in a Jira-style fashion, they were able to actually take the victims and hand them off those beacons to certain teams. So there's multiple teams on the C2 server, which is quite interesting. So yeah, that is something that I've not personally seen, and we've yet to see in the public, where now a company, right, is acting almost like an intelligence agency, if you can imagine what they're working at, and going after third-party infrastructure, which is in not every country is that legal. So so through that C2, go ahead, yeah.
I was actually going to kind of pull up, because I think this is interesting, because
pull it up.
We've now seen this a couple times, and I want to take a screenshot of this real quick for the team assignment and kind of how they did it. But we're now seeing organizations, they're divvying things up into teams. This is not a small operation. So Prodaf hacked into this group called Silverfish. They gained access to their web's console, and this was the breakdown of what their team looked like, right? So they even had an administrator, but they were able to just decipher that there was team 301, team 302, team 303, and team 304. And they were able to figure out those teams. Well, that's how they labeled them. But also, they were able to see like the team lead names. Am I correct, Joey?
Absolutely. And so as you're alluding to, it's not cheap to run that team or that infrastructure. And so you have to wonder then who's funding those operations, right?
Yeah. And then just to bring it back around to where you said, hey, they were actually assigning this to each team. You can see here where they were assigning to team 302, 303 or 302, and then saving that, right, in a very Jira-like fashion. So really interesting. I think this was a great article from PRODAFT, really digging into the internals of a hacker group, and they're very organized, they're concise, right?
This is visibility we usually don't gain access to, right? Usually it's like, hey, we think this threat actor used these TTPs to exploit our victims, right, or these victims, and here's how they did it. But to see it from the other lens, right, the attacker's lens, that's quite interesting. And we would not been able to do that had they not have done that. Now, there obviously we'll get into like the morality of that. Should companies be doing that? But regardless, unique lens. And so some of those victims there, they were 50% of the victims had a market value over 100 million US dollars. So these are not mom and pop shops, right? These are huge corporations. And kind of diving in really quick to the TTPs that were used, I thought were pretty unique. Enterprise Victim Sandbox, which they coined victim total. So the ability to curate and create malware, and then once you exploit a victim, to be able to run that malware in their environment and see if their endpoint detection actually detected it, and then use that information to then pivot to other victims. I mean, that is something I've never seen before. I think that's pretty unique and pretty out there, right? I mean, not something that's every day.
We kind of saw that in SolarWinds, right? Where once that they executed the malware, it would check to see if certain processes were running.
True. Yeah.
It's just a different way of going about that same function, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Man, yeah. Go ahead.
Go, Pete.
I just want to take a second there and address like two points, which is obviously you outlined a lot of detail around the back-end server architecture and how the C2 entire infrastructure of the C2 works, not just from physical servers and routing perspective, but actually the administration and the human element of it. Which is very unique, and we definitely do not get that. And as Joey, you alluded to, typically that comes through intelligence communities because they have the authority and capability to hack like this, to hack back like this. But it is a funny sort of shift here where we've actually typically been used to having a great level of detail around the malware that we observe and the capabilities from that angle with no understanding of C2. And in this case, I spent the entire time reading the report going, well, what malware, what payloads were doing this, and what did they do and what capabilities did they have? Because it was such a bizarre way of framing this around the opposite end of the equation. So that was really interesting. And then the last thing that you just mentioned there about the victim total sandboxing, I don't think this is the first group that's done this, but I think what's really curious here is that we see what appears to be a financially motivated operation that is willing to burn infected targets to potentially highlight that they have been in a network simply to gain the intelligence that their antivirus will catch this particular malware and how. And so it's kind of it should make you think for a second that we now have financially motivated crews that are compromising enough victims that they are willing to say, we might lose this, but we're going to detonate malware to see if it gets caught by their super sophisticated antivirus setup, whether that be through CrowdStrike, FireEye, all of your major players in this space. Do these endpoint protections and network protections catch this stuff? That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. And to go back to that, I mean, maybe that's just the objective of that team. That whole team was just to say, hey, let's test the defense of this. And then when that's done, they hand it off to another team for a different campaign, right?
Yeah, and what I was throwing up on the screen, Peter and Joey, was exactly what you guys are talking about. This is back to their dashboard that says there's even a comment section where you can claim it, right? Where you can see CyberBro EU has claimed one, a new hacker has claimed the other, but it says what country is this in, right? And multiple countries are listed. Then they have full screen iframe as the status. So they're organized. They're able to use multiple teams, pass it back and forth between teams, track where it exists. They can save comments in there. I mean, this is a level of sophistication that I think has been happening for quite some time. This is just our first big view into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, this team is no joke.
Yeah.
And we actually saw some of the ability to, we actually pull down one of the malicious PowerShell, the payloads, right? And we're actually going to post a blog here pretty shortly on this as we're able to help decode and decrypt it. But some of the interesting stuff they were doing was they were, it's all base 64 encoded, but in the first, there's 2 sections of the payload, right? And the first section is actually split up to help evade defenses, and then concatenate it again to actually decode it. And it does some interesting things like loading the AMSI module. And if you're familiar with that with Windows, what it does is it actually, AMSI is the module which allows the Windows subsystem to talk to antivirus products, right? And so if you can mess with that, right, and say, hey, everything's good, Windows, don't worry about it, or antivirus program, right? Antivirus goes, okay, cool, great, right? So we're looking forward to that blog post. One of our threat analysts is actually looking at that today. So, and then the final thing I wanted to say here is just thank you to PRODAFT. So we actually reached out to PRODAFT and wanted to collaborate with them. And they mentioned this actually in their report. If other teams were willing to do that, to let them know. And to reach out to them. And, we spent a lot of time talking about the importance of collective defense. I mean, even, in the intelligence communities, right, post 9/11, one of the issues Congress found was that each intelligence community had a piece of the puzzle, and had they all talked, they would have been able to discover this quicker. And so the same thing for us, for cybersecurity companies, right? We have a moral responsibility that I believe that if we only act in our silos, we'll never get there. But if we begin to work together on solving these nation state level crimes, we can help protect the people who trust us. So.
No, well said, Joey. I honestly don't think half the people in our organization could have said it that well. But thank you for digging into that. Now, let me ask you, if we're going to be solving these nation state crimes, and PRODAFT was hacking back in order to help solve this crime, is that the way forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, if you ask a lawyer, they're probably going to say hard no, right? This is definitely a Title 10 issue for, US code, right? So yeah, I'm kind of split, right? Because I'd be curious if PRODAFT had, if they had permission of the Swiss government to go do this, right? And we're seeing some aggressive actions in the past few years, right, where Microsoft has done some takedown things, right? But it's usually with permission of the government. The idea of a company hacking back is twofold, right? So if it's like, cloud infrastructure and not a big deal, okay, fine. But we all know, right? If you hack back and you take something down that's critical infrastructure, I mean, my gosh, is that an act of war, right? Did you do something unintended? And who's to say you're a professional and you're allowed to do that, right? And so, yeah, I mean, imagine 2 allies going after it, right? Or someone taking down something that causes someone's life. I don't know. So, like I said earlier, I think it's interesting because we would not see this perspective, and the teams and communities that can do this today, like Intel communities, U.S. government, they have a ability to see attacks perhaps before they happen, and they're able to see things that the private sector can't see, right? And they have a unique capability then. We need to strengthen our defenses in the private sector, but opening that door, I feel like you're opening a floodgate, and so that's something we have to figure out. But Joel and Pete would love to see what you guys have to say about that.
So Peter, I want to kick it over to you, but real quick, we have somebody really interesting in the chat, and I'm not sure if everybody who's watching this has ever met Dr. Mike Ehrlich, but he helped offensive cyber for the U.S. government in his past life. And I know he can't say a lot about it, but I would love to gain his insight. So Dr. Michael Ehrlich, while we have you, what are your insights on, do you believe that certain organizations in private sector should be allowed to hack back if they're working with the government? I think that's a huge question. Peter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm very conflicted on this because I think that unfortunately, the cards are just stacked against private organizations doing this on their own, or private citizens or organizations, anybody doing it on their own. And the problem with it is that you don't have the whole picture. And we kind of did see this with the PRODAFT report, where the connections they made, to the SolarWinds campaign, there was some talk in the report about how as Joey mentioned, the IOCs began from IOCs that were tied to SolarWinds, and then they fingerprinted that and scanned a broad swath of IP addresses, identifying further infrastructure that was likely tied to the same infrastructure like that was tied to SolarWinds. And so at that point, you've already made one leap, and then further leaps were made after that to try to tie the operations together, when in reality, all you've done is really tied these servers together and then made some leaps from there. And so it's challenging to say that these threat actors were exactly the same and it was all tied to SolarWinds, and you're justified at going after it. And what I'm outlining here is that in this case, this is a high-profile, huge incident, and it was easy to make some of these connections, and they did find malicious infrastructure and they compromised the C2 server. But what if the actor was very skilled and was aware that people are going to do this, and instead, tried to get you to go down that path and forced you to make these leaps and conclusions, but then in reality, it's a misattribution campaign and you've actually targeted somebody else? What are the geopolitical ramifications of that? You've now, as an entity from a country, whether that be private or not, attacked another potentially sovereign country, another government, another private institution that wasn't involved. There's all sorts of scenarios here, and I know that we're speculating pretty wildly, but at the same time, these are still realities that could happen, and it is troubling to think about what the geopolitical ramifications would be if private organizations within the United States got wrapped up in active hacking against other sovereign countries or other companies within other countries that then require a response from them. And now you have this, tit for tat, back and forth, constant, a churn of attacks that's not productive. That's not securing anybody. Granted, you might gain some intelligence like we did here, but the damage, the potential damage is far greater, and it doesn't actually get us towards security. It just gets us more information. And so I just don't think the juice, I just don't think it's worth the squeeze. I just don't see that, the risk is just too great, and I don't think the amount that we gain from it is enough.
I think that's great points, and it's really cool to see Dr. Michael Ehrlich also echo that, and I'll throw that here up on the screen. He said, the U.S. government doesn't use private armies. There are functions that are inherently governmental, and I think hacking back is one of them. And I think that's a great sentiment, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us, Dr. Michael Ehrlich. Once again, if you haven't connected with either Dr. Michael Ehrlich or Joey Fitzpatrick or Peter Rudzinski here on LinkedIn, please reach out to them after, get your questions answered, connect with them here on LinkedIn. They are a wealth of information. But Peter, I want to circle back, and I get to play devil's advocate to you for a little bit. So you said that it would just be this tit for tat back and forth. Whereas right now, organizations here in the US, we kind of got the golden handcuffs on us, right? We're here in the US, but we can't hack back. And it's just a barrage hitting us over and over and over. So whether we respond or not, that influx of attacks, it's already here. So at what point are we able to designate, and I'll kind of come full circle on this here in a bit, at what point does the US government designate a few organizations, similar to like what Switzerland has done with PRODAFT, I'm assuming, once again, I'm speculating wildly here as well, to then say, hey, with confirmation of the US government, we can now work together to take down these threat actors. And once again, I'm coming back to what you said. What could be the geopolitical ramifications? It could be considered an act of war. But Peter, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a couple things there, and you've sort of opened a can of worms, which is, I think we have a big problem, which is, like you said, we're already here and we need to address it. And so I think that obviously no one would disagree that we need to do better from a US perspective and a global perspective in general at disincentivizing active hacking like this. But one of the problems is that although you don't hear about it frequently, we all know that the United States is probably one of the most effective and most active as far as attacking campaigns like this. And so just because you don't read about it and just because it doesn't affect us in the United States doesn't mean that we're not just as guilty as everybody else at doing this. And this is kind of a taboo topic where we don't want to address the fact that we are probably some of the most active hackers out there. We're just some of the best at it and we don't get caught. And so we have a problem where if we jump around and stomp our feet and complain about this and say, hey, you need to have, we need to do something against all of this, we would have a lot coming back at us as well. And so there's a very tricky world we live in where we've gotten to this point of very active operations on both sides. And so, yeah, we're both guilty, and we kind of need to come to an agreement and a way of dealing with this while disincentivizing from a global perspective active hacking campaigns like this. That being said, I don't think that passing that responsibility onto private individuals to make the decision from start to finish to do that, I don't think that's reasonable. I do think that we should look at other avenues to include private organizations in an active information gathering perspective. But I think that when you go into this, there also is some muddying of the water between hacks that could be disruptive to services, whether that be because of the way that the exploit functions is potentially risky to deploy on a system that might cause service disruption, or whether it actually was intended to disrupt services. Because you can imagine, if I get ransomware, what do I want to do to those ransomware operators? I love to deploy something really nasty that like destroys their hard drives or something like that, which we've seen in the past, right? That would be lovely if I could just go back and make it sting the fact that they hacked me. You can see how that kind of response would be desirable from a private organization. And that is not what we want, is some escalation of this. And that's what we have to prevent, is that I don't see a way that we can pass on that responsibility to private organizations, even if it's somewhat in partnership with the government. I don't see a way that de-escalates the situation. I only see that increasing tensions and causing more problems. And we are, as I mentioned in the beginning, probably some of the most guilty people at this. And so we need to kind of look at that from both angles. Do we really want to open that can of worms? Do we really want to go down that route? I'm not so sure.
Fair enough. So Joey, let me pitch it over to you. So I don't want to get into politics on this, but I don't think from a political perspective, we've ever approached another company or another country and said, hey, look, we're being hacked by your country. And we have companies like Microsoft and Amazon who are kind of taking down certain campaigns around the world when it's hosted on their infrastructure. But I don't think we've gone to another country and said, hey, look, if we see this coming from your country, will you address it if it's coming from your soil? Will you take down the infracting architecture and hackers and respond? Like, I don't think we're doing that at a global scale to date. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, interesting point. Almost like a NATO, but for internet security, right? There's no coalition that says, hey, we're the US, hey, UK, we see there's an attack coming out of your infrastructure. What can we coordinate together, right? Maybe behind the scenes there is this, but we need to do it so that most of the countries in the world behind this, where we all agree, right? When there's an attack happening, that host country will do everything in its power to help mitigate that. And I think that's a great first step in doing this. And so this reminds me of, I think one of our goals in the next 10 years has to be to increase the cost, right? Or impose costs on the adversary. This goes into game theory a little bit. I don't want to dive into that, infinite games versus finite games, but my belief is that cybersecurity, cyber warfare, cyberspace operations, right? It's all infinite games, right? There's no, you don't win at it, right? It's always going to happen. And so the way, and you guys both mentioned, right? We're seeing like this huge influx of cyber espionage, right? And cyber attacks and whatnot. And so one of the ways to get after this is to impose costs on the adversary. So instead of it taking, say Russia or China, 5 guys in the basement, right, in a $10,000 budget, and that takes them, say 6 months and $1 million budget to perform one attack on one company. And that's how you get after them. You go after their pocket. So
great insight. Well, Joey, I'm really glad to have you on the show, and I look forward to doing more of these in the future. Peter, as always, added a ton of insight into this. If you're watching this, will you guys spam the clap? Just smash that clap button and thumbs up button for these gentlemen. Thank you guys so much. I learn something new every time I talk to you. So thank you guys for joining us. Peter, will you do you have any closing thoughts for us before we wrap up today's show? Yeah,
I just want to say it's been exhausting. We've had an exhausting year, starting from Christmas time of last year. If any bad guys are listening to this right now, please give us a break, man. We need a month where we just don't have a massive, humongous incident to deal with. And if SolarWinds could go away and never be referenced again, I'd love that too. So that's what I'd leave us all with.
Awesome, Peter. And I think that's a great ending point. And also, I want to turn it back to our viewers. Guys, thank you for joining us today. We do this for you, so we look forward to seeing you. We are going to be doing the first Thursday of every month. We'll be doing cyber lookbacks. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the support you've shown us all here today. With that, this is the end of the April Cyber Lookback IronNet edition. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.